Okay. So, dear audience, thank you for your patience and resilience during this very packed seminar. I am still Merethe Lind Jodalen, and I represent the Norwegian Tibet Committee. The climate crisis is indeed a global crisis. And it is tempting to quote Antonio Guterres at the opening of the COP27 in Egypt on Monday. It's a scary quote. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. I am very grateful that we use Tibet as a case study for today's climate panel. Tibet is the climate crisis most people have never heard of. A crisis and a people that China is trying to hide. The importance of the rainforests and the Arctic is common knowledge to most of you. But the importance of Tibet and the Himalayas is not. Since invading and occupying Tibet in 1949, China's policies of infrastructure development, mining, and rapid urbanization have aggravated the environmental degradation that is affecting the quantity and quality of Tibet's grasslands and water resources. Tibetans who live in Tibet under China's brutal occupation cannot be part of the conversation, but they must be part of the solution. As we speak, a delegation of 5 Tibetan women, obviously they are all living in exile, among them environmental research fellows, are working hard to get the environmental crisis happening in the Himalayas on the agenda during COP27. But they are only allowed to attend side events. Did you know that Tibet holds the largest store of fresh water outside the Arctic and Antarctic? And that right now, Tibet and the Himalayas are warming 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth. If you don't, you will learn about this and more today. So I will give the word to our moderator, Sigrid Heiberg, who is the leader of the Oslo Green Party and also a substitute member of the Storting, or Parliament. She will present today's knowledgeable panel. The floor is yours, Sigrid.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. So we will now have a panel for about an hour. We will first have some introductions, then a panel discussion, and then we will open for questions at the end. We have unfortunately had one change of panelists. So Mr. Reinhard Butikoffer won't be joining us on screen, but luckily we have Ola Elvestuen. Oh, sorry. Ola Elvestuen from the Norwegian Liberal Party, MP and former minister, will be joining us. So I suppose you could come and take your seat, Ola. And then we're also very lucky to have Mr. Martin Mills with us from the University of Aberdeen, where he teaches anthropology and directs the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. And I think that what we will do is we will start with Mr. Michael Buckley, who is author of Meltdown in Tibet, China's reckless destruction of ecosystems from the highlands of Tibet to the deltas of Asia. Can you hear us, Michael?
Yes.
Beautiful. So
yeah.
I will give the word over to you.
Hello, Tajidale. I'm going to talk briefly about China's rampant exploitation of Tibet. Mainly about mega dams and mega mining. Basically, China is doing what every colonial power has done through recorded history, which is exploit the heck out of the colony. So here's a visual of what that looks like. It's a parody of Edvard Munch. And everything is connected here. First comes the high-speed train to Lhasa, which enables the import of migrant workers, Chinese migrant workers who head out to build mega dams on the rivers of Tibet, and they head out to mine the heck out of Tibet, all kinds of minerals from uranium to lithium. Well, that was a Norwegian joke. We're going to move on to a Chinese joke. This is the UN In September 2020, Xi Jinping appears. You got to remember, this is during COVID times. So he's telling the UN that China is going to be carbon neutral by the year 2060. And why is that a joke? Because it would be a miracle by any standards, because China is the major CO2 polluter of the planet, with over 25% of CO2 annual emissions coming from China. And how is he going to achieve this miracle? Well, he didn't go into details on that. It appears that some of the power, the clean and green power, is going to come from nuclear plants, which is viable, I guess. And then it appears that the majority or the major part of the power is going to come from hydropower, which Xi Jinping claims is green and sustainable and clean. And where is that hydropower going to come from? It's going to come from Tibet. But basically, the whole of China is saturated with dams on their rivers, and you can't build any more dams in China itself. So the only place left, and I'll move along to this photograph, this map here, showing all the major rivers of Tibet, 10 major river systems, that some of them coming through China, others flowing into Asia, India. And China is tapping into all of these rivers, except for one or two, which it probably will tap into later. Now, this is basically the green dam myth that's coming out of the mouth of Xi Jinping, because what he's proposing is solving one problem, the energy problem, clean, green energy he maintains, but you're creating an even bigger problem at the same time, which is you're destroying these rivers and the ecosystems that they support. So you've solved one problem and you've created an even bigger problem at the same time. Besides which, the dams are not exactly clean and green. They have massive methane emissions from their vast reservoirs with rotting vegetation trapped. And that offsets any claim to clean and green, because these mega dams are the same as coal-fired plants when it comes to emissions. It's just that these are methane emissions, which are 30 times more potent than CO2 emissions, by the way. Here's a quote, if we have any chance to stop any of this. It's a quote from a Chinese activist. Chinese activists are certainly not happy about these dams either. Why can't China have just one river from Tibet that doesn't have a dam on it? And the answer seems to be, well, we can't do that. China cannot do that because China just likes to exploit things. So I'm going to move along here to some of the major impact of these dams downstream, in the nations downstream. And we're looking here at a photograph of Shaowan Dam, which is on the Mekong. This is 4,200 megawatts. It's about the size of, well, the output of power is around that of 4 nuclear reactors. The dam itself is massive. It is, for height and width, twice the size of the Potala Palace, if you can imagine that, with a reservoir, massive reservoir behind it. And this is only one of the dams. There are 11 of them in Yunnan on a cascade here. And they've been built since 1994. And, with these dams, with such dams like this, China can basically turn the tap on and off on this river. It has that power. And this is dangerous for the downstream countries because during the wet season, China releases the water and floods the downstream nations, releases it from the reservoir. During the dry season, China stores the water to run the turbines, and this is exactly the opposite of what the river cycle normally is during the wet and dry seasons. So it's upsetting everything downstream. Basically, you're looking here across the Tibetan Plateau as at the biggest water heist in recorded history, with damming and diversion. China can also divert the water from any dam via the reservoir for its own use in agriculture and industry, whatever it wants to use. So this is what it looks like to the downstream nations. This is called weaponizing water. China can threaten the downstream nations if it wants. We'll turn the tap on and off the way we feel like if you don't play ball with us. Those are some of the problems involved with megadams. There are many other issues. There's the question of sediment, which is the vital nutrient-rich material that flows with the river. That's being blocked, can be blocked up to 90% by megadams. And then there's a question of fish migration and spawning, which is also blocked by megadams. I'll move on here to mining in Tibet. And mining is actually connected with the dams because in some cases, the mining is operated, the power for the mining comes from dams that have been specifically built to power those mines. For example, Yulong copper mine in Chamdo. There's a dam there that powers up the mine, the largest copper mine in Asia, one of the largest. So China is prospecting for over 120 minerals in Tibet. Some of them highly valuable, like uranium, which is used in the nuclear program, and lithium, which is used in electric vehicles. And we're going to look at a photograph here of the grasslands of Tibet, which is severely impacted by mining, Chinese mining. This is a nomad yak hair tent looking across at a Chinese mining venture. Of course, the nomads, no Tibetans are very happy about this because they don't like to see their homeland desecrated, the grasslands. And the grasslands are a major carbon sink. These are huge grasslands. By opening up ground like this, you're laying the place open to desertification, which is sweeping across the Tibetan plateau. And China has removed the nomads in some cases to clear them out of the way so it can go in for mining and mega dams. It calls the Tibetans backward, wants to civilize them by putting them in concrete ghettos. I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of mining, only a few. This one here is a coal mining venture, illegal because it takes place in a national park. It's in Qinghai, Muli, there's the area. And if you look carefully at the front, you'll see a fox because this is a national park. China bribes people. They'll just change redraw the outlines of the park to suit whatever venture they're into. And this particular mine was exposed by Greenpeace, East Asia. But 10 years later, it's still operating, even though it was exposed as illegal, because the person behind it is very powerful. And here's a satellite image of lithium extraction from a lake, also in Qinghai. There's major lithium production in Qinghai and also in far west Tibet, which makes Tibet one of the major sources of lithium for Chinese production, except that China never reveals if it comes from Tibet in its products. So if you have an iPhone or an iPad that's made in China, it will never indicate the source. And China will probably say, oh, no, it's not from Tibet. It's from South America. It's from Chile or somewhere like that, because it knows what the problem is. And this is how China gets around regulations, deceives the world. So right now, talking about deceiving the world, happening in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt is COP27. And so could the UN come to the rescue in Tibet? Well, not likely, because Tibet does not have any representation at the UN. The representation is via China, and China doesn't want to talk about problems in Tibet, not even melting glaciers. Doesn't want to talk about rivers in Tibet. So these problems are going to be ignored by the UN. But think about this. There are up to 2 billion people that depend on the rivers of Tibet in Asia, in India, in China, and other downstream nations like Bangladesh, heavily populated, and also Pakistan. And yet none of this will show up at the UN, the COP. So, they will just carry on ignoring it until we have a disaster of titanic proportions, which is what's shown in the graphic upcoming. And I was going to finish here with one last picture, which is China calling for a global green revolution. This popped up. You'll often see this in the press. You'll see these wonderful things about China. China is building a green wall across the north of trees and so on, things like that. But I'll draw your attention to call for. That's a future thing. It's not happening right now. It's a call for. And this is what Xi Jinping is very good at, calling for things, but they're not actually happening. So he'll say one thing and turn around and do entirely the opposite. So this is greenwashing at its finest, and the Chinese are very good at it. They'll lobby this word green around for everything. Green dams, green, even green, I've heard green coal mining, if you can imagine that. So I will stop there, and we'll carry on the discussion And namaste.
Thank you very much, Michael. I have to say, green coal mining reminds me a lot about what we do in Norway, which is green drilling for oil. But we'll leave that for another discussion. I want to move on to you, Ola. Picking up on some things that Michael said, I am sitting here with my iPhone, and I'm very aware, but I think also my clothes are actually made in China. And I want to ask you, from your perspective and from a Norwegian politician's perspective, how is Norway and Europe now dependent on China for materials that we need now and in the future for the green transition?
Very strongly, of course, and too much in many ways. But I think I would like to start on the COP that we have on the climate negotiations. But because now this week I'm also going there to Sharm el Sheikh on tomorrow actually. And of course, if you look at how the discussion should be, what is very astonishing with Tibet is the complete silence. There's not a discussion at all. And if you look at the situation and also as was mentioned here, the global warming is warming 3 times the rest of the world. Of course, if you had at least some freedom in China, Tibet should have been in those negotiations and those discussions at the same level as the Arctic or small island states. I mean, small island states have a much stronger position than their size should be, and the Arctic is always present. But Tibet is complete silence in these negotiations. And if you look at how the negotiations are being put forward, of course, we always have to remember that the UN is a member organization. That is so it is always so you have to work with the members, and China is a member, but so you have to get as far as you can in an agreement and put pressure on every part to do this. And I have led negotiations in Katowice on the rule book for the Paris Agreement, and also on loss and damage when it was in Madrid. And if you look at those that are really difficult, the hardest group of countries, because you negotiate with groups of countries, it is G77 and China. So that is where, and the Chinese insistence of being a developing country, both to lead, and of course, if you are a developing country, no matter how many commitments you can make on supporting climate action in developing countries, they do not have to pay. So that is one group they are in. And the other one that is even worse than G77 and China is the like-minded group, which is China, Saudi Arabia, everyone else that really do not want to do anything. So that we have a agreement on the Paris Agreement, that is a good part. And the rest of us has used the other groups, because G77 and China, that is a lot of the countries that are there, they are also participate in the Africa group, they participate in the Small Island State, they participate in ILAC, that is the South Americans. So we have to use those also to push China into a position. So, and that is possible. But where we need to understand how can we influence China, it is by using what is the core of the Paris Agreement, which is really the peer pressure. That is, we have to ourselves be in front, and you have to expose what others are doing, and we have to expose what China are doing, and that is something that we should be much better at. Also on on COPs like the one now in Egypt, the pressure on China will not be put in the negotiations rooms, because they have to get a consensus. It has to be put pressure, but you cannot confront on Tibet or human rights and everything, because then there will be no agreement. But in everything else that happens, it should be put forward and be a theme much stronger than it is today. And that also has something to do. But then, of course, onto your question, is for the last, and if you look at this one statistics that's very astonishing every time I see it, and it came out also yesterday. That's the Carbon Tracker Forum, I think, that shows what are the emissions in 2022. It comes out every year. And then you look at the ones this year, you see that from China, the emissions from China on fossil fuels in 2000, they were equal to Europe's combined emissions, and not even close to the US. Today, in 2022, they are 3 times the EU's emissions, or Europe's emissions, and they double the US emissions. And this incredible change, of course, when you start to think about that and what that means for resources and extraction of resources in Tibet and other parts of China, it is incredible what must have been done and what must have been done when it comes to mining and everything else. And of course, the problem is that as we have, Europe, we have worked for the last couple of decades to make green alternatives competitive. That is solar panels, that is batteries, that is everything. And they have become competitive. Now they are spreading. But of course, the Chinese have been also not only building their own economy, but they are also worked very consciously about controlling the new green economy by taking control of the resources and making sure that most of this are manufactured in China. So when we pursue our green shift that we need, we are so dependent on the manufacturing and the value chains that goes all the way from China. And if there's one thing we have to change, it is this. We have to build up value chains that are much more diverse, and so that also the green shift can be a positive thing, whether it's in mining in Democratic Republic of Congo or other areas where our companies should take much more responsibility. In China, this is impossible with the regime you have. So that is one part of it, and the other part is, of course, that you have the confrontation, and I mean it is not. We have viewed it as we are in a competition with China, but I think it's much more a confrontation and a much harder competition than it has been viewed as earlier, because they are. It is not only on being the largest economy or having the most powerful country, is also that includes also a confrontation with our system, with our democratic system, with our freedom, and with our value chains in a way. So it's also it's to get control of the green shift and have a better control of the value chains, but it's also our self-interest to not be as dependent as we are today on China in the future value chains that are there. And then, of course, the most important to influence within China, I think it is speak openly. We have to be more like Lithuania and dare to say openly what is going on and expose that at every possibility that we have, so that also China can be influenced from the outside. Because that is one thing that holds the Paris Agreement, and hopefully also the Convention on Biodiversity that holds it together, is one thing, and that is that no country wants to be the spoiler, not even China. No one wants to be the reasons for it not becoming an agreement so that we can move forward.
Thank you, Ola. So moving on to you, Martin. I was just thinking that a couple of weeks before the COP started, Mr. Xi Jinping walked out in front of the world media as the most powerful Chinese leader in decades. And I guess that the assumption that was held in the West for a long time, that as China grew stronger economically, that it would also become freer as a as a society, that has been proven wrong. How do you think, what has been the driving force behind the last year's development in China, the way you see it?
Yes, I'm just want to make certain this works. I mean, this is a really good question, and this is a question that was asked earlier by the gentleman up there, who sort of said, well, why does China act this way in places like Xinjiang, in Tibet, with reference to diplomatic processes, with reference to Norway? You know, why is this powerful kind of, and often quite aggressive driving force? And I think it is important to understand the kind of drivers that are at work here. So as you're not familiar with me, my name is Dr. Martin Mills. I'm the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. And up until the end of last year, I was the secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet for the Scottish Parliament. And in the last final 2 years, we carried out a climate change inquiry on the impacts of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding what is called the Third Pole region, all the mountains like the Karakoram, the Tian Shan, the Himalayas, all of those. As Merethe said earlier, you know, this region, the Third Pole region, is called the Third Pole because its combined glaciers, snow, and underground permafrost constitute the largest source of fresh water outside the Antarctic and the Arctic. The only difference is, and this is vital, it is the only source of such water in such scale that has half the world's population depending upon it. The fresh water that melts off the Tibetan Plateau, well, it immediately feeds 225 million people in the immediately surrounding area. The river basins that come off it, which are the Indus, the Sutlej, the Salween, the Mekong, the Yangtze, the Yellow, the Tarim, you know, most of Asia's rivers feed off Tibet and feed off that melting ice that is there. That constitutes 1.9 billion people. And the food and material that is produced in there serve about 4.5 billion people, so roughly speaking, half the world. Okay. What was clear from our 2-year inquiry, in which we sat down and we went through 900 scientific publications from the Chinese Academy of Sciences to NASA to look at what was occurring there, was that the Tibetan Plateau's cryosphere, that combination of ice, of snow, and of permafrost, what the Tibetans would call kawachin, that combination, starting from 1980, has been critically compromised. Effectively, 1980 was the tipping point for those river sources, because it was the point of time when the average temperature across the Tibetan Plateau went from below 0 degrees centigrade to above 0 degrees centigrade. And that's the point where ice turns to water. Now, this creates a catastrophic driving effect on the destabilization of the rivers around Asia. But since we're here talking about China, let's talk about China. China is faced with a number of massive drivers, and it's very tempting, I appreciate, under the circumstances of the last 30 years, to think of China as this sort of strangely mysterious power. It's terribly powerful, and we must all do our best to live with the fact that it's there. And one of the questions that has arisen is precisely the question you've raised, which is we all expected as living standards went up for political liberalization to occur. And quite the opposite has occurred. It isn't that it hasn't occurred, it's gone completely the other way. And it is important to understand that, and here I will endeavor to answer the gentleman's question as well as I can, to understand that what is occurring here is the degree to which China in particular is driven by the consequences of the massive economic expansion that it underwent, the consequences of environmental and climate change, and both of those in the context of the post-Tiananmen deal. The post-Tiananmen deal within China, as most people probably know, after the Tiananmen Square massacres and after the protests in Tibet in the late 80s, there was a kind of existing deal that that occurred at the end of Deng Xiaoping's rule. And it was, you can get as wealthy as you like, just don't get involved in politics, okay? And that was the deal. The problem with it is that deal is precisely now what is under pressure, because China's, particularly in mainland China, and here I don't talk about Tibet and I don't talk about Xinjiang, but in mainland China, the increase, as Laura mentioned earlier, the massive increase in living standards and in wages has, for example, shifted dramatically China's food security requirements. Its capacity to actually fulfill its own food needs has been massively compromised simply by the fact that everyone is wealthier. If we go back to 1979, for example, the average food production, the food consumption, meat consumption in a Chinese city was about a third what it is in the States. It's now actually almost twice as high as the States. An enormous shift, particularly towards meat consumption, most particularly, for example, pork, has actually, it's not possible for China, particularly in its northern regions, which are suffering from significant climate change and increased desertification, to fulfill those goals, all right? So, in a sense, sustaining the expectations of the Chinese population as a result of the massive expansion has now become difficult. So it's impossible to say, well, now you're in a situation where you said, well, you know, don't get involved in politics, but get as wealthy as you like. It's, that little dream is coming to an end now. So how do you deal with that? And the pressures on China, as far as this is concerned, they are gargantuan. I mean, they are massive in comparison with most of the ways in small countries like the UK or Norway think about them. You know, the Tibetan Plateau is a quarter of the size of the People's Republic of China. It itself is the size of Western Europe. From one end of the Tibetan Plateau or the Third Pole region to the other, say, let's say Kabul to Chengdu, is the distance between Galway and the west coast of Ireland and Istanbul. That's how large we're dealing with. That's how large the Tibetan Plateau. This is the size of the PRC as far as this is concerned. And the drivers that are occurring there are macroeconomic in a way, macroscopic in a way that most of us can't sort of handle. The water supply issues that are coming off the Tibetan Plateau are one of the most major issues. You know, you can build as many dams as you like, but not if there's no water coming off. One of the things we've seen is that the Tibetan Plateau is actually transforming dramatically, despite the fact that the glaciers are melting, because the underlying permafrost is also melting, and permafrost is waterproof, and it keeps the water close to the surface. That water is going deep into the Tibetan soil, and the whole large slabs of the Tibetan Plateau are desertifying. Okay, China is responding to that in a wide variety of ways. The first thing it did with reference to the desertification was to blame the nomads. It emptied an area between Amdo and Kham, the size of France, of its indigenous population, to take it all away from the river headlands. It was only later that the Chinese Academy of Sciences discovered it had nothing, almost nothing to do with indigenous land use. It was to do with the fact that the underlying permafrost was melting. The Tibetan Plateau is turning into a large sponge. It is, according to NASA's GRACE FO satellites survey, it's increasing at water weight, its water weight within the Tibetan Plateau itself is increasing at 7 to 9 gigatons a year. And all of that is going deep, and the Tibetan Plateau on the surface is desertifying. And those rivers are destabilizing. The Indus is destabilizing. The Yangtze and the Yellow are destabilizing. And this is producing enormous pressures. Beijing, for example, is actually one of the most water-poor places on Earth. Okay? The average, in Norway, for example, you have 7,500 cubic meters of water per person per year. I didn't know if you knew that, but there we are. China has 2,500 across the board. Beijing has 119, full stop. The UN's absolute water scarcity is 500 cubic meters of water, fresh water per person per year. Okay, their water problems are huge. Not only that, the problem with it is when water goes deep, into a land as geologically rich as Tibet, when it goes deeper, the deeper the water goes, the more heavy metals it carries out of the Tibetan Plateau. Those are then added to by all of the factories along the rivers that go along the like the Yangtze and the Yellow. And by the time it arrives in Beijing, you've got cadmium, arsenic, a whole range of chromium, a whole range of very, very nasty chemicals in the water. So your fresh water is poisoned. So these are really substantial drivers that, effectively speaking, constitute a destabilizing condition for China, unless they control. And the control there is twofold. It is internal. We've seen that. We saw that in the discussions with reference to Xinjiang and Tibet. It's the control allows space for massive geoengineering infrastructure projects. Their water resource problem, for example, they have sought to answer in the last couple of decades with the South-North Water Transfer Project, the single most expensive engineering project in human history, to bring water up from the Yangtze to the Yellow region in the north. These are huge, huge canals that they actually had to move cities aside for to make way to these three major canals. Even then, it didn't actually answer the problem, because consumption simply went up and you still had the same problem. And if you don't have fresh water supplies, you can't run a factory, you can't build electricity, you can't have agriculture, and you can't feed your population. These are very severe problems, and that's what's on the agenda in the CCP when they sit down. It is not that China is powerful. China's back is against the wall. Now, that means, and from a kind of, as far as that's concerned, it's also doing this internationally with reference to the Belt and Road Project. One of its crucial requirements for the next 50 years is to ensure that countries are financially and legally in hoc to provide it with food. And if you have deep credit pockets, and China certainly does, because we've bought all of their goods for 30 years, you can do that as long as you have a banking system like BRICS to secure it. So here you can see the drivers that are forcing China into its kind of external position. And its external position with reference to Belt and Road, they are relatively explicit at. I attended a meeting in the Pall Mall, for example, of Westminster parliamentarians, Chinese ambassadors, and a few Chinese generals. And the Chinese general actually laid out for us in detail how economic control of these areas would lead to cultural control, would lead to social control, would lead to political control, and would eventually lead to policing control of the Belt and Road. That is half the world. So the goal, as far as he was concerned, and he, I remember sitting there taking photographs of all these slides. I couldn't believe he was just telling us this. But they see that as a very positive thing, because it brings unity and it answers their concerns. So it is important in this regard, therefore, to understand two crucial things. China is driven by enormously powerful forces, which the Chinese Communist Party are seeking to keep control of. And it's not sure whether or not they're going to be able to do that in the long run. And the second is, therefore, the kind of pressures that China will put on a diplomatic stage are going to continue. And Norway and Britain and everybody like that have to ask the question, well, under those conditions, how do we respond? Now, you're Norway, and I'm from the UK, so that's up to you to decide.
Thank you. I think I want to spend most of the rest of the time that we have discussing your final question, how do we respond? But I just want to spend a few more minutes on these drivers, because I'm wondering if the pressures inside, pressures and drivers inside China to continue the economic growth are similar to the ones that we have experienced in the West. Because we have had, in the last 50 years in the Western world, we have known the science behind climate change. We have known that we are depleting our resources and destroying our own future. But we have not managed to stop the system that we live under, which keep exploiting people and natural resources. So I'm wondering if you could reflect on how, so the Western democracies are in a way trapped in a system where people want to have good lives. Our politicians want to make sure that we have these good lives. Our good lives are dependent on destroying nature, which are destroying the fundament of our lives. and this cycle continues. And we still have not managed to turn it around in the West. So when we speak about climate or CO2 emissions, the CO2 emissions that are rising so rapidly in China are scaring everyone. And at the same time, the consumption or CO2 emissions of the US, for instance, are still much higher, and most of the Western countries still have higher per capita emissions. So I'm just wondering how the political system in China that is so fundamentally different from our own, when, say this summer when the Yangtze River runs almost completely dry, I'm wondering how does that affect the Chinese population and its political system? Because we see in the West, we have seen huge disasters in the last years. We have seen droughts where Norwegian farmers lose their crops. We have seen landslides and flooding in Europe, killing people, and still we do not manage to actually create policies that stop the pollution that we know needs to stop. So my concrete question is, when something like this it's evidence-based, people see it right in front of their eyes, how does that affect, because we know how it affects our political system, it doesn't really. It creates some headlines in the newspapers, we're scared for the future, and then we still vote for politicians that want to keep economic growth and destroy our planet. So, but in a political system such as China, what happens? The question goes to you, Martin.
Right, okay. Well, China has seen as an increase in quantities of internal dissent and protest for a long time. A lot of those haven't actually been, they've not been political in the way that we would understand them. They are about, for example, employment rights. They are about land rights. You know, when you build a city the size of Shanghai, for example, and in such a short period of time, you are going to drive millions of people off the place that they have lived for many generations, okay? And we see it, they're often called nail houses. They're kind of, you know, multi-generational houses. And there is a wide amount of protest in those areas. The degree to which those protests come together and coalesce is limited in that regard. One of the things, and ironically, this is a slightly cultural thing, ever since, even before the Chinese Revolution, the idea that the government was responsible for ensuring that the land and the environment did what it was told, all right, is seen as a defining element of what might be referred to as the mandate of heaven. Now, that mandate of heaven idea was an imperial idea, but it hasn't, you can see it deeply and richly involved in revolutionary literature, for example, through the Chinese Revolution as well. There was this idea that the state's job was to control the land and control the environment. And you can, this gives us some insight into these sort of massive things like the Three Gorges Dam. You know, these are, and the North-South Water Transfer Project. These are part of what the state's job is to maintain control. But what happens if you can't? I mean, I said earlier, you know, Tibet has passed beyond, across the 0 degrees tipping point 42 years ago. We have put that ice block out in the sun, and all that is required for it to be finished melting is time. We don't need any more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It doesn't work that way. All that is required, because the thing that is driving climate heating is not us, it is the sun. We've just put a catalyst in the atmosphere that is trapping that heat. And therefore, that heat continues to go up. And we have no idea whatsoever, really in all fairness, what to do with that level of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is incredibly stable in the atmosphere. You're breathing out right now. Okay, 90% of the carbon dioxide you breathe out right now, according to NASA, will stay in the atmosphere for 350 to 1,000 years. That is how stable it is. So getting rid of that stuff is at this point in time, we just don't have the kind of technology or the mass drivers as well to make that happen. So the continued heating will simply occur as we are presently stand. So when it comes to, I mean, Penn State University took our report and rather pleasingly ran it through their supercomputer. In the Indus, the yellow in particular, the Tarim feeding Xinjiang, these are rivers that will not be there as permanent rivers within 20 or 30 years. So what do you do under a circumstance like that? Well, I don't know is the answer, because apart from anything else, large number of people need to move. You know, the Indus and the Sutlej feed the Punjab, which is India's major rice basket, and Pakistan's. Pakistan as a whole is looking catastrophic. Large slabs of northwestern China are really destabilizing fast in terms of their soil consistency. These are very, very serious problems, and it is not clear how you reverse that.
I think that very gloomy end there is part of the reason why we failed to act, because it is so fundamentally enormous and scary what is happening to the ecosystem of our planet. I want to ask you, Michael, and you, Ola, as gloomy as the situation is, what do we do? And from today we have a Norwegian perspective. What can Norway do through our political system to impact the situation in the best possible way? I'm going to ask you first, Michael. You hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
Yes. So the question to you is, what can a country like Norway do to impact the situation in any meaningful way?
Well, you know, I'm from Canada, and similar to Norway, we are water rich. So we are the rich people. So, you know, it doesn't appear to us to be a big problem. But of course, the rest of the world it is, in particular in China. I think what we're missing here in terms of Europe and China is that everything in China is state-run, whereas in Europe you have corporations that are held accountable. So you can get stuck into them and you can put, you know, you can call them into question. But in China, you can't call anything into question because it's state-run. You just end up in jail. That's what happens to a lot of people, especially, you know, like protesters in Tibet. They just get thrown in jail. So over the summer, Sichuan dried up. There was a drought. And if you're familiar with the geography of Sichuan, it's heavily dependent on hydropower, coming off the Tibetan Plateau, of course. So what do? The only thing they can do is they can use the state grid, the southern China grid, to distribute the power, because suddenly they got blackouts. So, you know, what they've set up in the system that's been set up in China is not accountable to anyone except for the CCP. That's your biggest problem right there. And I think what was mentioned before, China being the biggest emitter of CO2, it's also the world's biggest emitter of methane. And, you know, when the Tibetan permafrost starts to thaw, and because of all the reservoirs of these massive dams, you're going to get more and more methane coming out of China. So there's a whole lot of, you know, climate scientists not even tracking methane. They're tracking CO2, but they're not tracking methane. Methane is 30 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So we haven't even seen the start of these problems yet. So as for solutions, well, the only thing that's going to work in China is you're going to have to get these Chinese NGOs working on problems without being shut down, and a number of them have been shut down. They've managed to stop some dam building. I mean, in Europe, they're decommissioning dams. In the States, they're decommissioning dams because they found out that they have very adverse effects. But is that going to happen in China? I don't know. So my answer is, I don't know.
Well, we have two I don't knows, Ola. So the question goes on to you.
No, but you have to, you cannot sit down. We have to work harder. There's no other way, because there's no other way to meet this. First of all, we have to stop to talk about Norway as a small country. Norway is a country, just like everyone else is a country, and you have the power as that, and that is we have to stop it, and then you have to work together. I mean, first of all, also when I was Minister of Climate and Environment, I refused to have bilateral meetings with Chinese ministers. I only had meetings that was in connection with the Paris Agreement, and I had in connection with the Convention on Biodiversity, because that makes sense. But if you have these bilateral, I mean, they are always the stronger part. I see no reason for it at all. And I refused to go there also. But that was my positions, not the government's, but mine. But then, of course, but we do have to cooperate. I mean, we have to work together with Europe, we have to work together with North America, and we have to understand that this is a global confrontation. So we have to work much more systematically to engage and cooperate with countries in the global south, whether it's South America, Africa, or in Asia. And we have to connect. I mean, if I look at Norway's point of view, we have to connect with the cooperation we have on the environmental issues. We have strong cooperation with countries like Indonesia, with hopefully again in Brazil, but others. But Indonesia is important. When it comes to preserving the rainforest, Norway has an important role there. But we should, of course, also have that much broader cooperation, and so that we position ourselves also so that countries throughout the world have an interest in integrating and cooperating with the democratic world, instead of being pushed into that dependency on China that China is so good at developing. Because they are working strategically. Look at every international organization. China has worked strategically positioning themselves in front and center, and no organization is too small for them. All over the place they are there, and they are building up their people that support them, or countries that support them. While we are sleepwalking, coming into these meetings, not prepared, not strategically prepared, this has to change completely, so that we are a strong enough force that they have to follow up. And it's not only the emissions that you look at. If you look at the Chinese, how they are driving the demand, they are driving environmental crime, it's astonishing. And all of this has to be confronted. And that, I think, is what we have to understand. And I think also that, yes, we are still, I mean, every big issue you have to break, stop, and drive back the positions. And we are still just breaking when it comes to emissions. But that doesn't mean that things hasn't happened throughout the last 30, 40 years. And of course, and in our countries, at least there have been debates and discussions. So even though we have also had a economic development, there has been battles about, yes, streams have also been preserved. But in Tibet, if the government wants it to be dammed, it will be dammed, no matter what. And I think the driving force is much more, the only driving force is for the Chinese Communist Party to keep their position. And it's just a power game and nothing else. And I think, I don't know how corrupt China is, I would say 100%. But these are the driving forces, and everything has to do with keeping their positions. Whilst we have to use the strength of our freedom and democracy and try to build up that. So I think, what can I say, that we have a climate crisis, we have a nature crisis, we have a crisis on pollution. But I think to solve those, it has to be used also in connection with freedom, a democratic development, at a minimum, and cooperation within those countries to be strong enough to stand up against China.
Thank you, Ola. I want to just open up quickly for some questions at the end. I see one there. And since we are running quite short on time, I want to collect all the questions and then give the panelists a chance to answer them at the very end. So do you want them to use the microphone? Okay. So we have one question there and one at the back. Anyone else? This is the, all right. So we do you and then Bente there and the two at the back, and then I will allow the panelists to answer. Go ahead.
My name is from Norwegian Tibet Committee. Thank you very much for all the information that we saying is that the Arctic will be melting and there will be a new passage, economical, and it will be easier for us to use the boat and build the economic connection. So in this regard, should we kind of stop China, or should we just continue like kind of saying that, okay, we have to build that dialogue?
Yes, thank you. My name is Bente Knagenev. I'm a member of the Green Party of Norway, and it was interesting to have a few minutes with you, Mr. Mills, before it all started. China is powerful, and with their Belt and Road Initiative, they are in Cameroon, Georgia, wherever. My question really is, even if they are so powerful, and they can maybe transport food from Cameroon to China when there is no more food to be able to grow in China, you cannot transport water from Canada or Norway to China. What do they do the day when they have no more water? That is my question to you.
Two more at the back. Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is also for you. So you presented really dire narrative.
Louder.
Sorry, it seems fact-based for right now.
Could you come to the front, just so our friend on the screen can hear you too.
Your last question was so great. We want to hear this one too.
We'll see. Okay, so you presented a rather dire narrative, seems fact-based for all I know, but it's also frankly imperialistic. They want to dominate. And my question is, how can you, if you go with that one, how are you going to say that so clearly that you can actually engage with it and at the same time, I mean, actually engage in fruitful discussion? I mean, that's a paradox, but how do you do that?
Thank you. My name is Björn Bratteseth. I'm a PhD candidate at Center for Development and the Environment. And I wanted to ask a question and also make a little bit of an observation. I have spent 10 years in China and Taiwan. I studied law in in China. And I think that there seems to be two choices that countries in Europe seem to have. It's either to build solidarity with other democracies and make difficult statements that will get them punished by China, or to speak China's language. I just wonder how much are political parties engaging with the ideology of Xi Jinping in order to find strategic ways to talk his language if you want to go that route. Because for me, that seems to be the only way in which you can actually be able to speak to them. But of course, that's going to reinforce those ideological norms in the rest of the world, and maybe that doesn't have the outcomes that we're looking for.
Thank you very much. We are about to run out of time, so I will ask you to please answer the most relevant questions to you and try to keep it to 2 minutes. And we will start with Michael. I hope you heard everything.
I did hear the last section. It was mute for a while, but I did hear it, yes. You're talking about dealing with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has been a no-show at COP27. And so is Narendra Modi. These people are not taking the climate seriously. I mean, what are they doing about it? China has said nothing until, it's going to do nothing about its coal peaking until the year 2030. It's far too late. So I don't think they're reliable partners. I mean, they have not signed the International Watercourses Agreement. They have moved into the South China Sea and claimed the whole of the South China Sea in contravention of international law. I mean, you cannot regard them as a logical player here. I think that they're in their own little world, you know, the celestial kingdom, you know, isolated from the rest of the world. They don't want to take part. They have the upper hand in Tibet. They just want to use their cards there. That's it. They're not a global player. I'll finish there before I get too angry.
We'll continue with you, Martin, and then Ola at the end.
Okay, wow, lots of questions there. One is, I was actually saying that China isn't as powerful as we think it is, but there's a lot of forceful bluster for very good reason. all right? And I do want to impress that idea upon. I also want to just back up what you said here. I mean, just speaking as a British person, can I just say how liked and respected Norway is? Just got to say this. Stop talking about yourself like you're a little country. It's like, we're just a small country. No. This is not how the rest of the world sees you from my perspective. Anyway, the real question here, let's come back to COP27 since Mike has raised it. I don't see COP lasting more than 3 or 5 more years, tops. Why? Because it overwhelmingly exclusively concentrates on the wrong thing. It concentrates on mitigation, which would have been fine until 50 years ago when we passed most of the issues. What we're looking at now, and what will cause most of our problems ongoing, is adaptation. The South North Water Transfer Project, the damming of the Tibetan rivers, the water control issues, the Arctic Ocean issue. Most of these are adaptation questions. You may recall when Trump, for example, offered to buy Greenland. Yes? That was, well, you laugh, but it was perfectly illegal. All you had to do was look at Pompeo's State Department front page, and it said, hyperspectral survey of Greenland for rare earth metals after it has melted, and port access to the Arctic Ocean. That is an adaptation move, and this is where wars start. China's moves into the South China Sea are because of its collapsing fish stocks and its requirement to provide fish for an increasingly wealthy population. So what does it do? It expands towards Japan's islands and everything on those lines. These are adaptation pushes, and unless the UN starts seriously talking about adaptation, not as a second to mitigation, but the primary question that actual international relations are being carved out of, it's going to become increasingly meaningless. So if I said I had an answer, that would be the one.
Yes, but still I hope that the COP will continue because we need it. But what you're right on, I think that, if the situation were not as serious as a international agreement, it's very impressive in many ways. But we need to incorporate also the Convention on Biodiversity that is coming. And you need also to have adaptation into it, but also the nature-based solutions, etc. That has to be there. Because you can use so much money on adaptation, but you also have to stop you also have to mitigate. It has to happen at the same time. Yes. So we need it, not because it's any good, but it's the only thing that's there, and it has to be used. And democratic countries has to work way more coordinated than we have been done. One position right now, because we need to diversify from China. But if you look now on how that is happening, if you look at what is very positive is the US Inflation Act this summer, which is the amount of money is positive. What is not positive is the Buy America clauses that are a huge amount of them. And that makes the competition between Europe and the US, because now all investments on these other value chains, they go to the US and Canada, and not here. And that hurts REC and REC in Norway on their value chains on solar panels, and it has to be dealt with right now. So that is also the cooperation has to be much broader. But then the questions. One, the Arctic. I think there's a lot of things. Now I have been in government. There's a lot of positions Norway has that is not being said out loud, and it's not smart to say everything out loud. So I think this is a country that's way more concerned, and we are better at positioning ourselves than maybe the public are giving us credit for, and it must be that way. So that is kind of like it. I think we are not bad in that issue at all. So that, and then it was the last. Now I forgot the last question. Yeah.
Perhaps we should
I
answer that
forgot.
over lunch, because I think
I
our
can do it.
time is up. Thank you very much to our panelists.